environmental consultants on this project. We'll talk about these sort of topics tonight. I've got a slide or two on each of them after talking about the process and the timeline. May talk just a little bit about the noticing and the distribution of documents, and then we'll talk about the real meat of the environmental impact report, what its contents were, what its findings were, and then talk just a bit about the comments that we received from people on that draft. So again, tonight's meeting involves this little presentation, comments by the public, questions that you all might have of us, and then just to reiterate the no decisions we made tonight on the EIR. The project information, most of you are familiar with. It involves the field lighting system and the exit lighting system for safety, public address system, sound wall behind the visitor side bleachers, a concession and restroom building, a future possible standalone press box behind the home side bleachers, and then a future ticket booth. Here are the approvals that are required for the process. First, chronologically, though not most important, is the certification of the EIR, and then the project approval itself, and then it goes to construction bids and contract approvals, and then the state Division of State Architect has to sign off on all the designs at some point. The purpose of CEQA and why we're here being paid to do this work and to give you this information is to identify the project's significant environmental impacts and to identify ways to mitigate them or to avoid those impacts. Discuss a reasonable range of alternatives to the project that still meet its basic objectives. This is a difficult project to come up with alternatives for because we're almost by definition constrained to the site itself and to a pretty tight site plan around the site. But we do analyze those in the EIR. Another purpose is to inform the public and the decision makers of the environmental effects of the project. And then I just want to point out that the EIR doesn't have any implications with regard to the approval or the rejection of the project. We are here to give you good information on which you can partly base your decision on the project merits. But to certify the EIR doesn't imply anything about whether you're going to approve or not approve the project. The timeline involved the earlier project back in 2011, and we circulated a draft initial study in May of 2012 and had a public hearing. A great deal of concern was expressed about the project. We got started on creating a response document to that earlier project's initial study, and right around that point, district staff and high school staff decided to talk some more with the neighbors, and again, we weren't part of these discussions, but my understanding is talk more with the neighbors, redesign the project a little bit. And so if you see the light gray line there, that sort of differentiates the earlier project from the current project that we're looking at. So the current project then involved a notice of preparation that we're going to be preparing this EIR back in November of 2012. We went about preparing it throughout early 2013. The draft EIR came out on May 1st. We held a public meeting about, looks like 6 or 7 days before the close of the 45-day public comment period, so as to give people some time between that public hearing held over at the campus and the time that their comments were due, so that people could come to that meeting, hear what their neighbors were saying, and maybe formulate some questions and comments. And we did then get some comments after that time as well. We then prepared the response to comments document, which is the second of the 2 volumes that you have on August 9th. We also prepared a very important document called the Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Program. A number of the comments on the draft were of a similar nature to the following, and that is, how do we know that you're going to implement all those mitigation measures and that all these good things that you're going to do to make the project more palatable will actually get undertaken? And that document is called that Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Program. Then just the last couple of bullets suggest that you might be able to certify the document as early as the 28th, a couple weeks from tonight, and only at that point, after you've dealt with the CEQA document, can you consider the project itself. Let's not talk about the noticing, but suffice to say that staff did undertake noticing that was more extensive than would be required by law. Documents were distributed to all of the usual places. I don't think there's been any complaints that people couldn't get a hold of the documents in order to read them. They were online as well. The draft EIR contents then include these various chapters. Let's sort of skip through this. In doing the initial study, which is the first piece of work that we do to analyze environmental impacts on the revised project, we were able to focus out issues that were not thought to be problematic and which no one raised, and so questions of forestry or minerals or things like that, they were obviously not going to be concerns. The issues that the combination of that initial study, as well as just having heard from people what issues they were concerned about, led us to include these 5 topics in the main text of the EIR. So this is what got the detailed treatment in the EIR for this revised project. Let me take a second here to talk about, within 2 slides, I'm going to give you a little graphic over here in just a second, about the question of what a significant impact is, because there's a great deal of misunderstanding or lack of wonkiness on the part of people who don't do this for a living about what significance really means. And I want to point out that what we do is to establish a threshold beyond which the effects of the project are called significant. We do that transparently and before we do the analysis. And we base that on either regulatory agencies like, say, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, or if there were endangered species on your site, it would be Department of Fish and Game or Fish and Wildlife. Some of these regulatory agencies, they're known to have expertise in those subject areas. Or the district may have their own significance thresholds. Not very many school districts do. Most cities do. In the case of your projects, the ones that we're working on in different cities, at your behest, and maybe even without your knowing it, we have gone to the local city and we have imposed their standards on your projects, which is, I would say, the most sort of neighborly and conservative thing to do. So if the city of Concord had standards of certain types, we've used those in order to judge that question of whether an impact was significant or not. A couple of points to make at the bottom there. One is that impacts are direct physical changes to the environment and reasonably foreseeable indirect physical changes. What they are not, what the law does not allow us to look at, what we're not either charged or authorized to look at, are social or economic changes. And you've heard tonight a couple of references to things like property values, whether they would or would not be affected by a project like this. That's not something that we're allowed to look at, though we might want to. So here's a little very, very simple graphic of how that significance notion works. Imagine, and we'll just use air quality or air pollution as a sort of conceptual example here. Imagine that the bottom, let's see if I have a pointer. Down here, this area right here, let's call that current air pollution levels. And this would be 0 down here, and this would be a lot up here. Okay? So there's current amount of air pollution in a given area. Here's, let's say, what your project would generate up here. And again, the size of those rectangles is not meant to suggest anything about air pollution for your project. I'm just using it as an example. There's an example of where the significance threshold would be. So you have it set ahead of time. Then we go out and do the analysis and we show what those impacts are going to be. Here's the part that we would call less than significant. Impacts which rise up to that level but don't exceed it. Here's the part that we would call a significant impact, which would require some mitigation measure to be imposed. So in each of these topical areas that we analyzed in the document, a similar thought process has been gone through, and hopefully it's explained clearly so that people understand what the thresholds are and what we used. I think oftentimes when people disagree with our findings, it's not so much that they think the math is wrong or the model was wrong or something technical is wrong, it's that they employ a different value judgment about where that significance threshold would be. To a lot of people, if they notice anything at all that's a change, then that represents a significant impact. But that's not what the law says, and that's not what cities have adopted or these regulatory agencies. So in the EIR itself, we're now getting to the meat of what we found. We found no significant impacts for all of these various topics, and that's all explained for the most part in the initial study which was prepared prior to the EIR. We found in 5 different topical areas impacts which would be significant, and in each of these cases we were able to employ mitigation measures to address them and basically to bring that amount of impact down below the level of the threshold.